So this video for reading 46, which is an excerpt from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. This video is in a lot of ways going to be lengthier than the reading itself, which is pretty short. But similar to the video on education, where I kind of went over the conflict perspective of education and I went over kind of a history of racial inequities in the education system. I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to start off with an overview of the criminal justice system and particularly how people, sociologists in particular, who look at the criminal justice system from a conflict perspective, some of the questions they ask, some of the data that they have collected and interpreted, because it provides a really good context to this excerpt from the book, The New Jim Crow. And then at the end, towards the end of the video, I will, of course, talk about the reading itself a little bit more directly. So, beginning with that sociological context, the criminal justice system is the term that we use to refer to the network of organizations involved in law enforcement and the administration of justice. And this is a little image that I got from the US Bureau of Justice Statistics that tries to show, the different pathways and the different organizations and steps that comprise the criminal justice system here in the U.S. Particularly if we are thinking about law enforcement, an organization that plays a critical role are the police. And although we and is as sociologists, this is oftentimes the beginning of our available data, is the data that the police collect in regards to the people that they stop and cite and arrest. And certainly, depending on what happens post arrest, this kind of shapes the rest of a person's experience within the criminal justice system. And it's worth noting that, this part of the criminal justice system alone has been shown to have its issues with biases and subjectivity, because police are not robots and they have a lot of discretion in regards to who they stop, who they cite, who they then take the next step of arresting. And people that study the criminal justice system have identified four factors that they say influence the occurrence of arrest. One of them is the nature of the alleged offense. Obviously, it's not really up to the police's discretion to, whether or not they're going to arrest someone that, committed a murder. Usually, in most cases, at that point, an arrest has to be made. But, whether or not they decide to, arrest someone or cite someone for jaywalking or littering or trespassing or even things like shoplifting, all of that is kind of up to their discretion. Another factor is the quality of available evidence. Because this is such an elaborate system, in a bureaucratic system, it can get bogged down in paperwork and inefficiencies. One way that the police deal with that on their end is to not introduce cases into the system if they feel like the necessary evidence is not there um, for a successful conviction. If they don't feel like the available evidence is very strong, then they oftentimes won't make the arrest. And this is something that has, in this day and age, when we're especially focusing on crimes related to sexual assault, for instance, this has been a factor that has come under increased scrutiny. Another factor, the third factor that influences whether or not an arrest occurs, has to do with the demographic characteristics of the offender. Age, race, and sex have all been shown to impact the likelihood of arrest. With older people, like think senior citizens, being much less likely to be arrested comparative to people that are young adults. Certainly, in terms of race, we'll discuss that further on future slides, but racial minorities seem to be arrested at a higher rate for particularly nonviolent crimes comparative to white offenders. And once again, especially if we're focusing on nonviolent crimes, um, uh, women are less likely to be arrested than men. And the fourth factor is level of deference shown to a police officer. So once again, if your offense is not something really great, whether or not the officer chooses to arrest you might be based upon something as how polite you are, how respectful, do you get hostile or upset. In a perfect world, you would think that these types of subjective things should not affect arrests, but that's not the world that we live in, and police are just people. So all of these factors have been shown to impact arrest decisions. And that's really important to note from a sociological standpoint, because of course, so much of our research and our conclusions is dependent on data. And especially, before the last 10, 20 years, there wasn't a lot of good evidence just about stops, like who did the police stop and speak to or talk to. Really, a lot of our data begins with the arrest. So if some people were never getting arrested, then it was almost like their deviance, the crime that they committed, but then like never got entered into the system for. It literally doesn't exist within the statistics that come out of the criminal justice system. Now, going beyond law enforcement, who is responsible for the administration of justice? Well, that responsibility primarily lies with the courts. Whether it's a judge or a jury, this is how they determine the guilt or innocence of people accused of committing a crime. Exactly, how our court system is set up, the fact that we have, felonies versus misdemeanors, and then we have like, some courts, the right to a jury is protected. In some courts, there's usually not a jury present. The court system, the juvenile court system, is separate from the court system where we see adults. You don't necessarily have to know all those details. Just know that, once again, that there are a lot of inequalities that exist on every single level regarding which cases get seen versus which cases get thrown out by the DA before they even reach the courts, in terms of how they are tried. Once again, what types of charges does the DA press for? Is a plea bargain offered? And if so, what are those terms? Is the person being represented by a public defender, or do they have the ability to pay for private counsel? What How are demographic characteristics like race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, how does that reflect perceptions of the defendant by both the judge and the jury? So for sociologists that study the criminal justice system, all of these are things that they consider. And that's because if we only focus, right, on the people that are actually convicted, found guilty, wind up in our incarceration system, then in that sense, we maybe a good way of thinking about it is we're focusing on people that literally drew bad cards all around. They never got to exit out of the system, and it doesn't necessarily give us the most or the best understanding about who is committing crimes, so much as it gives us an understanding about who is caught, who is arrested, who is charged, who is found guilty, and then who then has to pay, in regards to their crimes. As far as being incarcerated. And so that's not the same question as who commits crimes. What we do know about the people that do wind up in our incarceration system is comparative to pretty much almost any other country. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, and it's our incarceration rate has grown significantly since the 80s, and so it, that also kind of complicates our understanding about the relationship between who is committing criminal acts versus who is incarcerated. And that we discussed that in terms of the concept likelihood of imprisonment. um, And that question about who is arrested, who is convicted, who is incarcerated, and why, for sociologists, they oftentimes focus a lot on particularly the roles of race and gender. um, and we know that, knowing your race, knowing your gender, looking at the intersection of the two, different groups of people have different lifetime likelihoods of imprisonment. So for white men, it's 1 in 17. For Black men, that says 1 in 13, but as you can see, that's really like 1 in 3. For Latino men, it's 1 in 6. Um, Regardless of race, for men it's 1 in 9. For women it's 1 in 56. So once again, that's that gender effect that I spoke of previously. But then that varies by race, with white women being 1 in 111, while Black women are 1 in 18. So as a sociologist, the answer to the question, does race and gender seem to impact imprisonment, seems to be yes. But the follow-up question that we have to then ask ourselves is, but maybe blanks just commit more crimes. And that, like I said, is a difficult question to answer because of the fact that we don't necessarily have good data for people who are committing crimes, but are not necessarily being, stopped by the police, not being arrested by the police, not being charged within the court system. Like, we lose that data. So how do sociologists try to answer that data? How do they try to answer that question, who commits crimes? Well, certainly for some types of crimes, we can do self-reports. And one good example of something that we frequently collect self-reports on is drug use. So we know that self-reports around drug use suggests that the gender and racial disparity between drug use and drug conviction is not as stark as the conviction rates would make you think. If you looked at drug conviction rates, African American men are most likely to face drug possession convictions, while white women are least likely to face drug related convictions. But if we look at self reports where people are just indicating their usage of illicit drugs, we'll see that, the gap between white men, Black men, Hispanic men, white women, Black women, and Hispanic women isn't that great. And particularly for white women, their self reported drug use places them even higher than Hispanic men, and significantly higher than Black women and Hispanic women. Now, self reports aren't perfect data, and we could raise the question like, well, maybe some people are being more or less honest. Um, Other ways in which sociologists try to get this data is by looking at people that use like private clinics and rehabilitation centers. They look at admissions records for ERs for people that are coming in for overdoses. And once again, those more objective forms of data seem to suggest that America's drug problem, the extent to which Americans use and overuse drugs, does not seem to break down along the racial and gender lines that America's incarceration rates for drugs would make you suggest. So then it becomes like, well, who gets caught then and why? And to address this, you have to address the role of profiling. And this is where it becomes kind of like a chicken and an egg, because if profiling is based on past patterns and statistics about who is arrested for these crimes and convicted of these crimes, and those arrests and convictions are racially or gender biased, then using that biased information, you're going to be more likely to then profile people who fit the profile of the people who have been convicted and incarcerated, not necessarily people who fit the profile of people more apt to do this. A good example of this is back when the NYPD had a policy, a stop and frisk policy, where basically it kind of meant that officers didn't really have to have a real, a real strong or solid reason for stopping you. They could kind of just stop you and then frisk you. And they were primarily looking for things like guns, drugs, and other weapons. And so this data is based off of, they had to keep data about their stops, and then they had to keep data about what they found for each of those stops. And so how you interpret this. So um, Blacks in New York were stopped 2.3 million times, and there were 16,000 seizures of either guns, drugs, other weapons. For Hispanics, they were stopped 1.4 million times, and there were 14,000 seizures. And for whites, they were stopped 435,000 times, but 16,000 seizures. So how do you interpret this? One way to interpret this data is, especially if you're just focusing on race, that means that you stopped a lot of Black and a good number of Hispanics, probably men, probably young, without actually, for probable cause, and therefore they did not have anything on them in terms of guns and drugs. 143 Blacks and 99 Hispanics were stopped before you had a seizure, as opposed to whites, 27, which means if you stop someone white, you probably weren't looking at their race. You were looking at things that were probably more helpful in terms of profiling. Are they acting suspicious? Are they acting erratic? Did you see them stash something? Those types of things lead to having a successful stop in terms of then seizing something. And so, like I said, once again, this data just suggests if you're looking at things primarily through a racially lens, um, you are going to, it's not the most effective. But the other way to look at this is if you are looking at things through a racial lens, that also means that certain types of people committing crimes, racial minorities, men, young people, are going to be more apt to be caught because you're profiling along those characteristics. And that means other types of criminals, white, women, older people, are less likely to get caught because they're not even being stopped. And so once again, it's this idea that there are these levels of bias, and this bias is our data as well. And you can continue to ask these questions at every different kind of step of the criminal justice system. Who gets arrested, who has to go to court, who gets a plea bargain, who gets probation versus who has to be incarcerated. At every single step, these types of questions can show the ways in which a system can become biased against people based on these identity characteristics. And this is just a slide kind of showing the emergency room visits, that more objective data that I was discussing further. This is our national longitudinal study of youth. So they regularly, collect data about high school seniors using drugs. And then, of course, we get our drug arrest rates from, the criminal justice bureaus. They collect that data at multiple levels. So we have pretty good data there. And then this is emergency room visits for that year's time. So it's all just trying to build a case that, it's not necessarily that certain types of people are committing crimes so much as it is certain types of people are definitely more apt to be profiled, to be caught, and to be convicted. And then, of course, this does relate to socioeconomic status, because not only are the disadvantaged arrested at higher rates, but they don't have the money to pay for private attorneys, so they rely on public defenders. And that impacts the level of care and the level of commitment that attorney can kind of devote to their particular case. There are also issues with, of course, just kind of disparities in laws. A very good example comes from the war on drugs. There was the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. So basically, there was a mandatory 5-year sentence if you have 5 grams of crack cocaine. But to receive a 5-year sentence for just powder cocaine, you would have to have 100 times as much of the cocaine. So it's that 1 to 100 disparity. So in this way, people who had cocaine, a drug that especially in the 80s and 90s was associated more so with upwardly mobile people, more likely to be associated with whites because they were associated with upwardly mobile people. You would basically have to be like, I don't know, Scarface, like from the movie, like a dealer to get a lot of time for that type of drug. However, if you had crack, which was even it was a derivative of cocaine, um, you could have a much smaller amount and wind up serving significantly more jail time. Um, Another policy that seemed to have racial implications was repeated drug offensive sentencing. The fact that people were supposed to get harsher crimes if they had multiple arrests for drugs. But because, especially for smaller amounts, some people were, not arrested, just received citations. They got placed in the rehabilitation track as opposed to the incarceration track, or they were not found guilty. Very few, not as many people were sentenced to life under this law is what the law would suggest. And of the 573 people who were in over those 5 years, only 13 of them were white. Once again, not the type of statistic that really aligns with what we know about drug usage when we look to more objective measures. And then even something like death penalty sentencing. Not only are minorities more likely to be sentenced to capital punishment, but people are more likely to receive that sentence if the person or people that they murdered were non-minority. And what we now know, based on our exoneration evidence, so as our DNA technologies have gotten better and they've gone back and re-looked at some of these cases, since 1989, 311 people were found innocent, meaning they had been found guilty, and they are on the death and they were on death row. But as it turns out, the DNA suggests it was impossible that they committed this crime. 193 of that 311 were African Americans. For a group of people who only make up 12 to 13% of the population, once again, this suggests a kind of embedded implicit bias in how this system is operating. Which brings us now to the reading itself. So she begins with discussing the idea that the criminal justice system in the U.S. functions like a racial caste system. Basically, a caste system meaning that some people are, it, by caste, it means that you're born into it. And it's not something that's easily escapable. But then also that, on the basis of your race, you're treated differently, you have different privileges, and you face different discriminations. And she talks about how initially she thought that this was crazy and overblown idea. And then she kind of starts to discuss some of the things that went on to change her mind. Things like racial profiling and police brutality, how drug law enforcement looks different in poor communities of color, the hardships that former inmates face when they try to re-enter a society. And so she's like, ultimately, she wound up concluding that mass incarceration in the United States, in fact, has emerged as a comprehensive and well disguised system of racialized social control. And that way, it is similar to Jim Crow. And so, for the rest of the reading, she goes on to talk about, the language that we use in the colorblind era has shifted since Jim Crow from race to criminality. So, you don't necessarily walk around saying, like in the Jim Crow era, all blacks this or African Americans that, but instead, you focus on their status of criminals. Um, and this in itself is problematic because the criminal justice system is so racialized. And she goes over some of the same things that I kind of went over, things related to nonviolent crime rates, having increased at a much greater rate than violent crime rates. And a lot of this was related to drug related policies. And a lot of those policies seem to have poor minorities as their focus, even though we know that it's not just poor minorities that do drugs in this country. Other policies that she discusses that I've already kind of addressed, stop and frisk, which, as she notes, part of what led to it being disbanded is it was seen as being a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Um, so it's a problem to shift from racial language to criminal language, just be for one reason, because of that link between the criminal justice system and these embedded racial biases at multiple points in the system. But then the other kind of issue she has, which I find, her arguments about this very fascinating, and certainly this is just the entire book is a good book for you to read, to consider, is is it really fair, even if there weren't these racial biases in the criminal justice system, to create this like separate lower caste, where we lump all ex-offenders? If the goal of incarceration is, for people to be punished and then to be rehabilitated so that they can enter back into society and be successful contributing citizens, then treating ex-offenders as a lower caste who find it hard to get jobs, who find that some people won't rent them apartments, in some states they're not even able to vote. Is this, should this even be legal? um so she talks about kind of her interpretation of all this data. And she definitely says that part of the issue about talking about the biases in the criminal justice system is that if you can't prove conscious intentional bias, you cannot allege racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. So we have a lot of findings, and we have a lot of data that suggests that this is going on, but it doesn't quite meet that standard. And it's especially difficult because we really don't live in an era where the majority of people overtly state or claim to be biased. So no one's going to say, I'm going to give this person the death penalty because they killed a white person and not a person of color. Like, that's just not something that most people in this country are now comfortable saying. But if you look at the statistics that come out of capital punishment cases, you can clearly see that that has to be a bias that is somewhat embedded in a lot of people that serve on these juries. And so that quotation she offers, in this way, the system of mass incarceration is now immunized from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much as slavery and Jim Crow laws once were protected from constitutional challenge. So, because it doesn't meet that standard of being overt and consciously biased, it makes it hard for there to be kind of a overhaul, on the basis of it challenging, or um, what word, I'm kind of blanking on my word here. It's hard for people to challenge it, using the Constitution and the fact that it's denying people constitutional rights because it doesn't meet that standard of being overtly and consciously biased. And she ends the reading by stating that although, no one person, party, institution is to blame, we all are complicit. And I really like that ending, because we've turned away from people who have labeled criminals. We view them as others, unworthy of our concern. And, we remain silent, even though we have a sneaking suspicion that the criminal justice system isn't working as effectively as it should. And so, even though she's not a sociologist, she ends this with a real call to action, that this is something that we should, better address in the future. So, the question I want you to consider based on the reading: Alexander suggests that all of us are complicit due to how readily we buy into stereotypes about criminals. Do you agree? What types of associations or assumptions do you make about ex offenders? Are they a group that is permissibly stigmatized, discriminated against in our country? What are the long term consequences if we do not find a way of integrating ex offenders into society? And how can we do this better?